The alchemical practitioner does not begin their journey in a vacuum. They arrive at the threshold of transformation, carrying invisible burdens, projections woven into the psyche long before conscious thought emerged. These are the father complex and the mother complex, psychological structures that Jung identified as among the most potent forces shaping human consciousness. In the alchemical tradition, the great work was never merely about transmuting base metals into gold. It was, at its deepest level, a process of psychological liberation, a methodical dissolution of the inherited patterns that bind the soul to unconscious repetition. The father complex manifests as an internalized authority, a voice that either elevates or diminishes the individual's capacity for autonomous action. It may appear as the tyrannical judge, demanding perfection and condemning all failure, or as the absent sovereign, leaving a void where guidance should have been. The mother complex, equally pervasive, operates through emotional entanglement, either smothering the individual in protective fears or abandoning them to a world perceived as inherently hostile. These complexes are not merely memories of parental figures, they are autonomous systems within the psyche, scripts running beneath awareness, determining how one relates to power, nurturance, creativity, and the self. The alchemists understood this implicitly. Their texts speak of the king and queen, the Sol and Luna, the sulfur and mercury, dualities that must be reconciled within the vessel of the soul. What modern psychology calls complexes, the alchemists encoded in symbol and allegory. The practitioner who enters the alchemical path without confronting these internalized parents will inevitably project them onto teachers, doctrines, and the work itself. They will seek a guru to replace the father, a tradition to replace the mother, and in doing so they will perpetuate the very bondage they seek to escape. The great work demands something far more rigorous: the conscious dissolution of these projections, the reclamation of authority from phantom sovereigns, and the integration of parental archetypes not as external gods, but as internalized functions of a mature psyche. This is where the journey must begin, not with abstract metaphysical speculation, but with an unflinching examination of the invisible architects who shaped one's inner world. The practitioner must ask, whose voice condemns me when I fail? Whose fear paralyzes me when I attempt to create? Until these questions are answered, the alchemical vessel remains contaminated and transformation remains impossible. The alchemical tradition, when stripped of its ornamental mysticism, reveals a doctrine of radical psychological autonomy. The central thesis is this: the individual must become the sole authority over their own transformation. This is not a rejection of tradition or lineage, but rather a recognition that all external teachings, all inherited wisdom, must ultimately be metabolized within the crucible of individual experience. The father and mother complexes represent the primary obstacles to this autonomy because they operate as internalized authorities that preempt genuine self-determination. Jung's contribution to understanding these complexes was to demonstrate their archetypal nature. The personal father and mother, the biological parents who raised us, are merely the initial carriers of far deeper patterns. The father complex connects to the archetype of the senex, the old king, the principle of order, law, structure, and judgment. The mother complex connects to the great mother, the principle of nourishment, emotion, dissolution, and return to undifferentiated origins. Every human psyche contains these archetypal poles, and the personal parents serve as the first mirrors through which these universal principles become personalized. The problem arises when these complexes remain unconscious. An individual with a negative father complex may spend their entire life in rebellion against authority, never recognizing that the authority they rebel against is internal, not external. They attack institutions, teachers, and systems, failing to see that the tyrannical father lives within their own superego, condemning every autonomous impulse. Conversely, a positive father complex, unchecked, produces dependency. The individual seeks external validation, measures worth by approval, and cannot trust their own judgment. They become eternal students, collecting certifications and lineages, but never stepping into their own authority. The mother complex operates through different mechanisms, but with equally constraining effects. A negative mother complex manifests as fear of life itself. The world appears dangerous, relationships feel suffocating, and independence seems impossible. The individual remains psychologically infantilized, unable to separate from the emotional matrix that first gave them shape. A positive mother complex, paradoxically, can be equally limiting. The individual becomes addicted to comfort, to emotional validation, to the promise of unconditional acceptance. They avoid the necessary suffering that accompanies growth, seeking instead to return to a womb-like state of dependency. The alchemical path, properly understood, is the systematic dismantling of these complexes through a process the tradition called solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. The practitioner must first dissolve the unconscious identification with parental projections, recognizing them as internalized voices rather than objective truths. This dissolution is painful. It requires confronting the terror of standing alone without the father's approval or the mother's protection. But dissolution alone produces only chaos. The second phase, coagulation, involves the deliberate reconstruction of authority and nurturance as internal capacities. The individual learns to father themselves, to provide structure, discipline, and judgment based on their own values. They learn to mother themselves, to offer compassion, acceptance, and emotional sustenance without external dependency. This doctrine stands in stark contrast to much contemporary spirituality, which often replaces personal parents with spiritual parents, gurus, masters, and traditions that promise enlightenment through submission. The alchemical tradition, at its most authentic, contains no such promise. It offers only a method: enter the vessel, endure the fire, observe the transformation, and emerge as the one who wields the flame. The authority you seek exists nowhere but in the self that emerges from the crucible. Any teaching that demands you surrender this authority is not alchemical. It is merely a replacement of one complex with another. The philosophical foundation, then, is clear. Liberation from the parental complexes is not achieved by denying their influence, but by consciously metabolizing them. The father and mother must be confronted, understood, and ultimately integrated as aspects of one's own psyche. Only then can the practitioner proceed to deeper layers of the work, because only then does the vessel contain a unified operator, rather than a fragmented assemblage of internalized voices competing for control. The alchemical texts describe a sequential process of transformation, often divided into stages such as nigredo, albedo, citrinitas, and rubedo. These are not merely chemical operations, but maps of psychological metamorphosis. When examined through the lens of parental complexes, each stage corresponds to a specific confrontation with inherited patterns and a progressive reclamation of psychic autonomy. The nigredo, encountering the shadow parents. The nigredo, the blackening, is the descent into the unconscious. Here the practitioner confronts the shadow, not merely their own repressed desires and rejected qualities, but the shadow of the parental complexes themselves. This is where one meets the internalized tyrant father, who condemns all spontaneity, or the devouring mother who sabotages all attempts at independence. The alchemists called this stage the putrefaction, a necessary decay of old forms before new growth becomes possible. In psychological terms, the nigredo demands brutal honesty. The practitioner must inventory the ways they have unconsciously replicated their parents' patterns, even while consciously rejecting them. The son who despised his authoritarian father may discover that he has become equally rigid, merely inverting the content while preserving the structure. The daughter who resented her anxious mother may find that she has internalized the same catastrophic thinking, directing it inward rather than outward. The nigredo strips away the comforting illusion that we are fundamentally different from our origins. It reveals that we are initially little more than vessels for transgenerational patterns. This stage requires sustained introspection. Meditation alone will not suffice. It often deepens identification with the observing self while leaving complexes untouched. What is needed is active imagination, dream work, and the courageous examination of repetitive emotional reactions. When rage emerges disproportionate to circumstances, the practitioner must ask, whose rage is this? When paralysis appears in the face of opportunity, whose fear prevents movement? The answers almost always trace back to parental imprints. The albedo, separation and purification. The albedo, the whitening, represents the separation of mixtures into their essential components. Psychologically, this is the phase of differentiation, learning to distinguish between one's authentic self and the internalized parents. This stage is marked by a growing capacity to observe one's own psychological processes without immediate identification. The practitioner learns to recognize the voice of the internal father or mother as a distinct presence, not as an unquestioned authority. This separation is achieved through what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. The individual must simultaneously honor the gifts received from parents, the genuine wisdom, care, or strength that was transmitted, while refusing to be defined by parental limitations. This is not rebellion, which remains reactive and therefore still bound to the parent, but discernment. The practitioner asks, what serves my authentic development, and what serves only the perpetuation of family patterns? Practically, the albedo manifests as boundary setting and the deliberate cultivation of distance, not necessarily physical distance, but psychological space. The individual learns to pause before responding to the internal parental voice. They create gaps between stimulus and reaction, and in these gaps, choice emerges. This stage can be particularly challenging because it often coincides with external family conflicts. As the individual changes internally, family systems resist. Parents may intensify their attempts to maintain old dynamics, and siblings may react with hostility to the breaking of implicit agreements about who holds which role in the family mythology. The alchemical practitioner must remain focused. The external parents are not the primary concern. They are merely the outer representatives of internal structures. The real work happens within the psyche, where the archetypal father and mother are being dismantled and examined component by component. What aspects of internalized authority are genuinely beneficial? Discipline, discernment, protection. What aspects are pathological? Shame, perfectionism, distrust of one's own nature. The albedo is ruthless in its precision. It does not allow sentimentality to preserve dysfunctional patterns simply because they came from loved ones. The citrinitas, the dawn of personal authority. The citrinitas, the yellowing, is often overlooked in simplified alchemical schemas, but it represents a crucial intermediate phase, the first emergence of authentic selfhood. After the dissolution of nigredo and the separation of albedo, something new begins to coalesce. This is not yet the full realization of the rubedo, but it is the dawn of personal authority, the moment when the practitioner realizes they can generate their own light. In terms of parental complexes, the citrinitas is characterized by the conscious assumption of self-parenting functions. The individual learns to provide themselves with the fatherly qualities of structure, purpose, and constructive criticism, but now calibrated to their actual nature rather than imposed from outside. They learn to mother themselves with compassion, emotional attunement, and the capacity to rest and receive, but without collapsing into dependency or self-indulgence. This stage is marked by experimentation. The practitioner tests new behaviors, new ways of relating to authority, new emotional responses. They may overshoot, becoming either too rigid in their newfound self-discipline or too permissive in their self-care. But each experiment provides data, and gradually a calibrated equilibrium emerges. The citrinitas is solar in nature. It represents the illumination of consciousness, the growing awareness that one need not remain hostage to unconscious inheritance. Crucially, this stage also involves forgiveness, not the sentimental forgiveness that excuses harm, but the philosophical forgiveness that releases one from the karmic burden of victimhood. The practitioner recognizes that their parents were themselves carriers of complexes, products of their own unexamined histories. This recognition does not erase harm, but it contextualizes it. The narrative shifts from "my parents damaged me" to "my parents transmitted the damage they received," and I now possess the consciousness to end the transmission. This shift is not merely therapeutic, it is metaphysical. It transforms the practitioner from a passive victim of fate into an active agent, capable of interrupting ancestral patterns. The Rubedo, integration and the philosopher's stone. The Rubedo, the reddening, is the culmination, the emergence of the philosopher's stone, the incorruptible self that contains both masculine and feminine principles in balanced integration. In psychological terms, this is the achievement of individuation, the state Jung described as the realization of the self, not the ego, but the totality of conscious and unconscious psyche, organized around a center that transcends dualities. For the practitioner who has worked through the parental complexes, the Rubedo represents the internalization of both parental functions as mature capacities. The father is no longer an external authority to please or rebel against. He has become internalized wisdom, the capacity for clear judgment and purposeful action. The mother is no longer a source of emotional validation to seek or flee from. She has become internalized compassion, the capacity for self-acceptance and emotional resilience. The practitioner now parents themselves fully, and in doing so, breaks the chain of unconscious transmission. But the Rubedo contains a deeper mystery. The integrated individual does not simply become a balanced combination of parental traits. Something genuinely new emerges, what the alchemists called the filius philosophorum, the philosophical child. This is the self that exists beyond parental influence, the creative potential that was always latent but could not manifest while psychic energy remained bound in maintaining or resisting complexes. This is the self that creates from authentic desire rather than compulsion, that loves without entanglement, that works without the need for external validation. The test of the Rubedo is simple. Can the practitioner engage with their actual parents or with authority figures and nurturers who trigger the same complexes without reactivity? Not with cold detachment, but with genuine equanimity, seeing them as they are rather than through the distorting lens of projection? If so, the work has achieved its purpose. The gold has been refined. The practitioner stands free. Every authentic alchemical journey encounters the moment the tradition calls the mortification, the death experience. This is not metaphorical death, but a genuine confrontation with meaninglessness, the terror of existing without the scaffolding of inherited identity. For those working with parental complexes, this crisis takes a specific form, the recognition that no parent, internal or external, will ever provide the security, validation, or purpose the psyche craves. This realization arrives with devastating force. The individual has already endured the Negredo's shadow confrontation and the Albedo's painful separation. They have begun to build autonomy in the Citrinitas. But then comes the moment when the full weight of existential aloneness becomes undeniable. The internalized father will never grant final approval. The internalized mother will never offer absolute safety. The practitioner stands naked before the void, and the void offers no comfort. The psychological literature on this phenomenon is extensive. Object relations theory describes the terror of abandonment depression, the primal fear that emerges when one relinquishes the fantasy of the perfect parent who will finally arrive to make everything whole. Existential philosophy, from Kierkegaard to Sartre, maps the anguish of radical freedom, the burden of creating meaning in a universe that provides no inherent purpose. The alchemical tradition encoded this same crisis in the image of the Negredo's deepest phase, where the materia is reduced to absolute dissolution, where all structure collapses into undifferentiated chaos. This crisis cannot be bypassed. Attempts to avoid it produce spiritual materialism, the endless accumulation of practices, teachers, and traditions that promise transformation without demanding the sacrifice of comforting illusions. The individual who refuses the mortification will collect initiations like talismans, seeking external confirmation while avoiding the internal confrontation. They will speak in elevated language about transcendence while remaining psychologically unchanged, still seeking daddy's approval or mommy's protection beneath a veneer of spiritual sophistication. What makes this crisis so acute is that it strips away not only the personal parents, but also their archetypal substitutes. The practitioner can no longer seek refuge in spiritual hierarchies, cosmic mothers or divine fathers. These too are recognized as projections, externalized fragments of the psyche, desperately avoiding its own completeness. The crisis demands a descent beyond all comforting fictions into the bare fact of existence. You are here, you are alone, and you must generate your own meaning. The alchemical texts warn that many practitioners fail at precisely this juncture. Unable to endure the void, they retreat into dogma, seeking the certainty of revealed truth to replace the authority they have sacrificed. Or they collapse into nihilism, concluding that if no ultimate parent exists, then nothing matters. Both responses represent a failure of nerve, an inability to tolerate the tension that precedes genuine transformation. The path through the mortificatio is not around it, but directly into its center. The practitioner must learn to sit with the terror, to observe the psyche's desperate attempts to reconstitute parental projections, and to refuse the temptation of premature resolution. This is active endurance, not passive acceptance. It requires what the alchemists called the patience of Job, the willingness to maintain the work even when the work appears to have failed utterly. Gradually, if the practitioner persists, something shifts. The terror does not disappear, but its quality changes. What initially felt like abandonment begins to reveal itself as spaciousness. The absence of an external parent becomes the presence of internal possibility. The void, no longer perceived as threat, becomes recognized as the ground of creative potential, the prima materia from which new forms can emerge. This is the turning point, the moment when death transforms into rebirth. The practitioner who emerges from the alchemical crucible is fundamentally altered. They have not acquired new knowledge or achieved a static state of enlightenment. Rather, they have undergone a reorganization of psychic structure. The parental complexes, which once operated as autonomous and often antagonistic forces, have been consciously integrated as functional capacities. The individual now contains the father and mother within themselves, not as voices to be obeyed or rejected, but as resources to be employed with discernment. This integration manifests in concrete ways. The individual no longer requires external validation to proceed with creative work or life decisions. They can assess their own performance with clarity, neither inflating their achievements through narcissistic grandiosity, nor diminishing them through internalized shame. They have become their own reliable judge, firm but not cruel, discerning but not paralytic. This is the internalized father functioning healthily, providing structure without tyranny. Similarly, the individual develops the capacity for genuine self-compassion, the internalized mother functioning without enmeshment. They can offer themselves emotional support during difficulty, can rest without guilt, can acknowledge limitations without collapse into despair. They no longer oscillate between self-abandonment and self-indulgence, but maintain a steady presence with their own experience, whatever that experience may be. The psychological literature describes this state as earned secure attachment, the capacity to provide for oneself the relational functions that were either absent or inconsistent in childhood. Neuroscience reveals that such integration literally rewires neural pathways, creating new patterns of emotional regulation and decision-making. The alchemical tradition, lacking modern terminology, simply called it the creation of the philosopher's stone, the incorruptible self that remains stable across changing circumstances. But integration brings responsibilities. The individual who has freed themselves from parental projections must now engage with the world from genuine autonomy rather than reactive patterns. This is harder than it appears. Old relational dynamics pull toward familiar roles. Family systems resist change. Colleagues and friends accustomed to the old self may react with confusion or hostility to the transformed individual. The practitioner must maintain their ground without rigidity, must remain open without collapsing back into old patterns. The final marker of successful integration is the capacity for generativity, the ability to contribute to others' development without creating dependency. The individual who has resolved their parental complexes can mentor, teach, and guide without needing to be a surrogate parent. They can offer wisdom without demanding obedience, can provide support without creating obligation. They recognize that true assistance means empowering others to undertake their own alchemical journey, not providing shortcuts that bypass necessary suffering. This is the goal the alchemists sought, not literal wealth but psychological wholeness, the capacity to live from authentic desire rather than unconscious compulsion. The practitioner who achieves this integration does not transcend the human condition, but fully inhabits it. They remain subject to suffering, uncertainty, and mortality, but they face these realities as a unified self rather than a collection of warring complexes. They have become, in the tradition's language, a philosopher, one who loves wisdom not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived practice of continuous self-refinement. The journey does not end. New layers of complexity always emerge. But the practitioner now possesses the tools, the internalized capacities that were previously projected onto external figures. They can father and mother themselves through whatever challenges arise. They have become the alchemist and the vessel, the operator and the operation, the seeker and the sought. The work continues, but now it proceeds from freedom rather than bondage. The gold you seek dwells not in the crucible's base matter, nor in any master's benediction. It ignites only in the will that refuses all substitute sovereigns and dares to strike its own flame.